Reality is objective.
Okay, we're back with another episode starring everyone's favorite philosophical idiot, Rocking Mr. E. This episode is about Nietzsche. So we get to have fun because I'm going to tell you a lot about Nietzsche, and he's going to demonstrate that he knows nothing about Nietzsche. Now, in a previous video about relativists, I pointed out that Nietzsche is really the only relativist he mentions, other than some of the postmodernists. Postmodernists are just trying to rip everything apart, basically. They're breaking everything down. But Nietzsche is the only relativist, but he's not a epistemic relativist. Rocking Mr. E thinks anyone's a epistemic relativist who doubts that what they see with their eyes may actually be what's there. Or anyone who is skeptical about science and thinks science has any limitations whatsoever is a epistemic relativist. Now, there's almost no epistemic relativists in philosophy. In fact, there is a Wikipedia page on it, and it's like a paragraph long. Because it mentions a few people who have actually advocated for it, none of which are famous, and then it's over. The Wikipedia page is over after that. It just doesn't exist in philosophy very often. Because if you're an epistemic relativist, then we'll just stop even doing philosophy. Just like if you're the kind of guy that Rockin' Mr. E is, who just thinks what you see with your eyes, what you see is what you get, which is basically Randian metaphysics, you might as well stop doing philosophy too, because there's no point to it.
And speaking as an atheist, I found that the left is by far the biggest culprit in propagandizing as the more rational side. But it's become clear to me that the left has its own metaphysical fallacies that are every bit as irrational as any right-wing religious zealot.
Okay, starting right here, let's talk about his left-right paragon. I think he's probably talking about, because he mentions being an atheist and that the left claims that they're more rational. Now, the majority of people on the left are not atheists. If you're talking about the United States, if you're talking about the politics of the United States, the majority of people on the left are not atheists. And there's quite a few atheists on the right, and they tend to be what he is, libertarians and Randians. And libertarians and the Randians are like probably the worst people when it comes to like what I think is rational, and I don't even have to make an argument to it because any objection to it is automatically irrational. I don't even have to justify the rationality of what I'm saying because it's so rational that it's obvious to anyone who listens that I'm rational and you're not rational. That's what you find with Randians and some libertarians. Like, they are smug, and I have blocked one from my channel because he's incredibly smug, because he keeps telling me I'm wrong about Ayn Rand, but won't address any of the specific arguments I make. So he's blocked because of that. Because anyone who starts claiming that they're rational and what they're saying is rational and you just can't argue with it, automatically I mistrust that person. Start to mistrust that person immediately. If they start like saying that I am rational all the time and my beliefs are rational, and anyone who is arguing against my beliefs is irrational. Start distrusting that person immediately. It's different than saying that a specific argument is irrational. Whereas, like, say when I'm debating with War Corpse, I give you a specific argument he makes, and I go, this is an irrational argument. That's different than just saying these beliefs are irrational, I'm not even going to bother dealing with them. And also, since this entire video is about Nietzsche, let's get this out of the way right away. Nietzsche is not left-wing. In fact, Rocking Mr. E has him in his playlist, Deconstructing Collectivism. Nietzsche is against collectivism. Let me get that out of the way. He is against collectivism. He is an extreme individualist. He is an egoist. Ayn Rand stole most of her ideas from Nietzsche. She just changed it from being a relative ethical theory to being a libertarian, supposedly rational, objective ethical theory. Nearly everything else in Ayn Rand is stolen from Nietzsche. Nearly everything else. So it's essentially stealing from Nietzsche. Nietzsche's makes more sense, even though I disagree with Nietzsche's. Nietzsche's actually makes more sense. Nietzsche is 10 times the philosopher No, I take that back. 100 times the philosopher that Ayn Rand is.
Left-wing relativists I encounter repeatedly try to distance themselves from labels. What they fail to understand is that sometimes labels are not only essential when we break down knowledge, but also inevitable once you accept that we live in an independent reality.
This is kind of hilarious, though it may not be immediately apparent to most people why it's hilarious. Because what he's saying is that these labels exist independently of human beings. Labels exist independently of language. They exist independently of human thought. They're just up in the sky. This is like the kind of argument that an extremely religious person would make if they weren't even thinking about how to make their arguments. Because it's not written in the sky. When I took biology in college, some of the questions that my biology professor would get from students, he would go about taxonomy. He would go, you got to realize about taxonomy is we make this stuff up as we go along. He goes, there used to be just 2 kingdoms, plant and animal, and there were 5 when I was studying biology in college. There were 5 kingdoms. Now they're going to make it 7, if they haven't already. And there might be even more. Because they're breaking them up and they're continuing to labels. Labels are always malleable. Because if we can find a distinction between these things, we can start breaking them up. They're always malleable. We may collect something under a label. We do it for the sake of argument. We do it for expedience sake. We do it in order to define things. Now we have definitions. What's important is that we make sure that when we're talking with people, we are using the same definition of words that they are. Now, Rocket Mr. E is an idiot. He thinks like objective reality, as if if you're a socialist, then you're objectively a socialist, as if we didn't make up what socialism is. And in fact, that saying you're a socialist actually covers a broad spectrum of beliefs. And there's a million different kinds of socialists if you really start breaking it down. So he just is saying that, whatever I call you, you are, because it's objective. So if I call you that, then that's what you are. Because he basically calls everybody who's on the left a Marxist. Even though I'm not a Marxist, but I'm a socialist. But he would tell me, no, you're just a Marxist, you just reject the label.
With this in mind, the term relativism is often used as a label for theories that support an undefinable reality.
Like I said in his video about relativism, he's using the absolute broadest version of relativism you could ever use, and he's not making a distinction between moral relativism and epistemic relativism, which is there is almost no epistemic relativism. There you can find moral relativism, which I don't agree with moral relativism either. But I have more respect for it than epistemic relativism. Epistemic relativism is pretty much indefensible, but Rocket Mr. E has basically framed it in such a way that anybody who's skeptical about reality becomes a epistemic relativist. So that means Nietzsche becomes an epistemic relativist by his definition. Hume, Kant, Descartes, pretty much everyone. Plato, Aristotle, everyone. Because all the giants of philosophy become epistemic relativists. If you go by his definition. Which is insane, because none of them are.
Relativism can be traced as far back as the ancient Greeks with the likes of Plato or Protagoras. And of course, postmodernism is a modern example. But the relativism that I find to be the most popular among left-wing atheists is existentialism, and in particular Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche experienced tragedy throughout his life. He lost his father and brother as a young boy and suffered from debilitating illness until he died at 55. In some ways, Nietzsche did succeed in creating a sense of hope for atheists coming to terms with a world where God does not exist, though his philosophy is mired in melancholy. In particular, this is prevalent in his concept of eternal return, where he states that life is a never-ending cycle that repeats itself over and over, and all are forced to go on living the same moment in a perpetual loop. Nietzsche attempts to remedy this sense of hopelessness by describing how it is the goal of each of us to learn to love each moment, becoming one with this cycle. The similarities between this and Eastern philosophies such as Buddhism or Hinduism is very clear, and this influence is also apparent in his other works and ideas, like the Overman. Some claim that the eternal return wasn't literal, though there is no solid evidence to defend such a claim.
So, a lot of stuff to chew on here. In his previous video on relativism, he claimed Plato wasn't a relativist. Now he is. Magically, Plato's a relativist. He wasn't a relativist before, but now he is. And Plato was more, I argued when I did his last video, that Plato was more of a relativist than Kant, who he kept calling a relativist, if you're going to make that claim, because he's mystic. He's a mystic. And you basically would call Plato, he's much closer to a rationalist than an empiricist. Some people have even said, like, Plato's philosophy is closer to religious philosophy, whereas Aristotle's is more like empirical scientific philosophy. It's not a perfect example, but it gets in a ballpark. So if you want to explain to people the differences between Plato and Aristotle, that's a good way to do it. If you're just starting, as long as you make sure to clarify which things don't fit into that analogy. But he talks about existentialism. Existentialists are not relativists either. Existentialists believe that there is an objective reality and that there are objective values, but that human perspective can keep us from ever fully knowing them. While some people's version of reality may be closer to a person's version of reality than another person's, nobody has a perfect knowledge of reality or of ethical truths, which may exist, may or may not exist. That is the existentialist view on morality. Atheistic existentialism, let me put it that way. Atheist existentialists think that morality may or may not exist. Theists kind of think that way too, but they have chosen to believe in God. So it's very complicated. It's hard. There's theistic existentialists though too. So how can you say they're relativists if they've chosen to believe in God? They think that they're theistic existentialists believe that they can't prove whether there's a God, but they've chosen to believe that there is. That is their choice. Nietzsche is not an existentialist, though, because he doesn't think that way. The way he thinks is, Nietzsche is an extreme moral anti-realist. He thinks that there are no moral truths. He flat out states that there are no moral truths. Man must create his own moral truths. That is distinguished from between existentialism, between there may be moral truths, but man must decipher them for himself as an individual. That is a different view. So Nietzsche is not an existentialist, though he influenced the existentialists. And Kierkegaard, who is the influence on theistic existentialism, is actually kind of a Kantian, because he believes that there is like a rational ethical way for humans to view the world. But he makes room for a possible God-based morality that is perhaps above Kantian morality. And he thinks that's higher. Kierkegaard thinks that serving God is a higher calling than serving just ethics, man-made ethics or rational ethics, like Kant's ethics. Kant's ethics are rational ethics, supposedly. And so Kierkegaard believes in a higher religious calling. Now, going back to Nietzsche and the eternal return, yeah, Nietzsche probably didn't think that was literal. When he talks about there being no evidence for it being literal, Nietzsche writes in a artistic, literary style. So it's very hard to tell what he wants you to take literally and what he wants you to take as a metaphor. Also, Nietzsche thinks that truth value and moral value are completely separate, because he believes in no moral truths. So because something's true or not does not affect what you should believe morally. Nietzsche's version of morality is you must believe what is good for you. When you are putting together your own morality, you should construct a morality that is good for you personally, That is Nietzsche's view on morality. And he doesn't think it has any relation to objective reality or facts about the world.
Nietzsche famously wrote that God is dead, though this was misinterpreted by many as literal. In actual fact, Nietzsche was describing how people had given up on God and needed to find an alternative moral principle.
He's right that some people think that God is dead is supposed to be taken literally, which I can't imagine. I actually found on a forum once where people were talking about pseudo-philosophy, because I use the term pseudo-philosophy to describe Ayn Rand. I consider her to be pseudo-philosophy. It's not real philosophy. I would also use the term to describe, like, Sam Harris. A lot of the new atheists I would use that term for. Pseudo-philosophy. But people argue over what is pseudo-philosophy and what's real philosophy. So I was interested, I went to this forum to see what people were talking about. Someone said Nietzsche was pseudo-philosophy, and they said, like, the reason that he was pseudo-philosophy is because God was dead. Obviously that can't be literal, because if God didn't exist, then how could he be dead? And then they said another really stupid thing. They go, and he said his version, which is that people had given up on God. And do you see any given up on God? I don't. I don't see any evidence of it. Nietzsche didn't think that people had given up on God in the 19th century. The whole God is dead thing is about Nietzsche worrying that science is going to replace religion and become the new religion. That's all it's about. It actually doesn't have anything to do with God at all. He's merely stating that if we make science the new religion and have it replace God, we're going to be in worse trouble. That's what he's talking about.
On this I can agree with Nietzsche, but I don't believe that he did this successfully. Nietzsche offered an alternative with the philosophy repeatedly referenced by relativist atheists, nihilism. Nietzsche, like other relativists, rejected anything objective about reality.
Okay, Nietzsche is not a nihilist. A nihilist would be somebody that says there's no such thing as right or wrong, there's no such thing as good or bad. And to try to even quantify that would be pointless. That's what a nihilist would say. He's also wrong about Nietzsche's view on reality, because while Nietzsche is a moral relativist, he is not an epistemic relativist, which we will get into.
While morality was the focus of nihilism, he also rejected objective knowledge with his concept of perspectivism. Nietzsche defended his views by claiming that all ideas are drawn from certain perspectives. While this is partly true if we accept that some social constructs do exist, it is certainly irrational to take this as far as Nietzsche did. Even if we were to entertain Nietzsche's interpretation of reality, we can still validate existence by empirically proving something via evidence-based reasoning, like the scientific method or axioms.
Alright, Nietzsche's concept of perspectivism does not mean that there's no objective reality. He merely means it is impossible for a human being, because each human being is individually different and inhabits their own version of reality based on their experiences, based on their biology, based on their beliefs. It is impossible for any human being to know objective reality for certain. That is what Nietzsche says. It's very similar to what a lot of other philosophers say about the same topic. If it was true that all we had to do to know objective reality was to observe things, then there would be no point to philosophy. Philosophy would not exist. What he says about Nietzsche's morality, Nietzsche's not a nihilist. He is reevaluating values. That's what Nietzsche says his project is. And he's definitely not an epistemic relativist. Another interesting thing about Nietzsche is that he believed that a lot of philosophers had made a mistake when they said that the senses were not to be trusted when he was talking about skepticism. Like, say, Cartesian skepticism, where Descartes says that the senses can be fooled. And Nietzsche claimed it wasn't the senses that could be fooled. He said the senses give us data. They just give us raw data. That's all they give us. It's the mind that can be fooled. It's how our brain interprets things that can be fooled, which is an interesting part of Nietzsche's philosophy. Is he says, no, the senses, there's nothing wrong with our senses. It's the brain. And the example he gives is a mirage. And he says, the data our senses give us when we see a mirage in the desert are exactly what reality is showing us. It's just our brain interprets it a different way and gives us an image that's not really there. And he has a point about that.
Relativists will often try to dismiss this with a counter based on solipsism, qualia, or epistemology, but it is through deductive and inductive syllogism that we can force the existentialist to accept that something exists. For example, if you accept that a tree is a tree through an axiom like A equals A, then it exists.
As usual, he glosses over some major, complex philosophical ground that would take a lot to explain. Qualia is something we use in philosophy of mind. It means the raw feels of things, like what it's like to see red, the color red. And usually what we argue with about qualia is qualia can't be quantified by just what's going on in the brain. It's one of those mysteries. Like consciousness, when we look at the brain, we see all these separate events in the brain, but consciousness seems to be a single thing. It's like a person in the movie theater watching a movie, and that illusion that they're not actually seeing one picture, they're seeing a bunch of pictures at once. So that's something that we talk about in philosophy of mind. It's much more complex than he makes it seem. You'd have to know a lot about philosophy of mind even to enter into this conversation. I don't know why he brings it up. It has nothing to do with anything, but he brings it up here. Another thing to mention is that A equals A is not an axiom. It's a tautology. It's something in formal logic. A thing has to be itself, basically. Like a tree is a tree, yes. That doesn't mean it exists. Santa Claus is Santa Claus. That doesn't mean Santa Claus exists. It's a tautology. An axiom is something we assume to be correct for the sake of argument. Scientific axioms, for instance, are justified by their ability to make predictions. If the scientific method works and we're able to make predictions and have repeatable results, then those axioms justify themselves. Moral axioms justify themselves as they correspond with moral intuitions that human beings have. Like if we give them situations, that's why there's so many thought experiments in moral philosophy, because we give people these thought experiments and ask them which one they think is the right way to act. And we try to figure out what our intuitions are about morality.
If you do not accept this, then frankly, I think you should go and see your doctor before the walls of your solipsism cave in on you. Qualia, on the other hand, paint the human senses as subjective on the grounds that we cannot know what someone else is experiencing. A typical argument here is derived from our concept of colour. Do you see red as I see it? While it is indeed true that the brain is one of the parts of the human body we least understand, it is certainly conjecture to use this to deny objective facts. Once again, it is through empirical data that we can disprove this argument, and it is via this method that our understanding of the brain is growing at a rapid rate, helping us to further explain the connection between mind and body. Modern technology is rapidly helping us to decipher the brain, especially with the development of MRI scans.
Okay, once again, his example about qualia. Qualia is not really about, we're not really worried about whether people are seeing what we see, because obviously some people do. Some people are colorblind, for Christ's sake. Like, some people do see the color differently. But we know most people see the same color because the psychological reaction is the same. Like, I've never mentioned this before, but actually before I studied philosophy, I was a film student. And when I was in film school, we studied things like how different colors affect the audience. So yes, we do know from the scientific method that people are seeing the same color most of the time. Because psychologically, the color red affects people in a certain, green affects them in a certain way. We know this to be true. So there's not a big problem there. He seems to think there's some huge problem. Not really, but but going on about this, color does not actually exist. It doesn't exist independent of human beings. It's how our senses interpret data. Color, the actual experience of seeing color, does not exist apart from human beings. Whereas the data that the ultraviolet spectrum that we're seeing does exist, But how we see color might be different than another animal sees color. Some animals are colorblind. Or an alien race. Imagine an alien race that sees color totally differently. There may be somebody born who can see, like we see red, but they see their sensitivity to color is actually greater. So they can separate, like a pile of tomatoes, they can separate a pile of tomatoes from are all red. We see them all as the same red, but they separate them as easily as we could separate green and red tomatoes, because they look as different to them as, even though we see them all as red, as green and red tomatoes. And that is an example that a philosopher named Frank Jackson used. I'm using his example to give you an idea of what it means. Now, personally, I am a physicalist when it comes to philosophy of mind, or I tend to lean physicalist more than, say, functionalists or other types of philosophies about philosophy of mind. But he just ignores this stuff like it doesn't matter.
So the mystery of the human brain is quickly shrinking, just like the freedom for relativists to give their views. Exactly the same thing is happening to religion, and it is for this reason that science is often attacked by relativism in all its forms.
So he seems to have this incredible confidence in science in general, and also the MRI data, which I'm neither a scientist nor a philosopher of science, but my advisor in college was a philosopher of science, and I've had discussions with him about the MRI things, and he says they don't know anything. They are just reading things from it that are not there. And I also talk to scientists, and actually I live with one, so I can just roll over in the middle of the night and say, what do you think about MRI research? And she usually says it's bullshit. It's just the oxygen, it's where the oxygen in your brain's going. That's all it is. And I roll back over and I go, oh, that's what I thought. So that's pretty much my take on it.
Nietzsche was cautious of science and once said that we can only hope that technology and science does not take over and be treated as the new religion. Some argue that eugenics is an example of why we must be cautious of science. But let's be clear, science is a lot like a car. It's an extremely useful contraption, though in the wrong hands, it's a deadly weapon. So blaming science for atrocities of eugenics is like blaming the car instead of the irresponsible driver.
Nietzsche had an extreme skepticism about science's ability to give us values, and that's what he was worried about. Nietzsche didn't believe in evolution, and he actually didn't understand it. He got it wrong, even for his time. And a lot of people think he didn't actually read Darwin. He just heard people talk about Darwin and misinterpreted Darwin. So Nietzsche is very anti-science. But he's right about science's inability to give us values. And this joker here doesn't realize eugenics is not science. It's an ideology based on science. So the actual problem isn't... I mean, he does get it right that, yes, people can misuse science. It's a tool. You can misuse it. But the whole problem of eugenics was people taking science and deriving values from it to begin with. That's the problem.
But Nietzsche also suffered a similar fate with his own philosophy. While he did not have evil intentions when he defined his subjective interpretation of reality, his ideas were still exploited by Hitler, with the help of Nietzsche's weak-minded sister. But we still have to ask whether Nietzsche made himself vulnerable to exploitation, given that he spent his whole life trying to break down objective truth.
Here's a great big ad hominem for you. People like to do this all the time. They like to say Nietzsche was a proto-Nazi. We actually have no evidence that the Nazis read Nietzsche. His sister was an anti-Semite, and she put together a book of his called The Will of the Power, which is composed of things from his notebooks, which she took out of context and put them in a way that reflected her views, not his. But Nietzsche was not an anti-Semite. Nietzsche's work is filled with railing against racism and anti-Semites. In fact, he says anti-Semites should be shot. Anyone who believes this stuff about Nietzsche does not know Nietzsche. They have not read Nietzsche. I, at one point, thought Rocky Mystery might have actually read Nietzsche, but I seriously doubt it. Because just the railing against anti-Semites in his work should tell you that. And he was not trying to break down objective reality. He is not an epistemic relativist.
Conversely, objective truth is far harder to take advantage of when logically sound. This is why the non-aggression principle is so important, given that it's a secular and objective way of navigating morality.
Now, the non-aggression principle is an axiom. It's justified in many, many different ways. The two easiest ways to justify it is rational, an appeal to rationality, which would be a Kantian way to do it. The problem is that libertarians and Randians like this guy want to actually destroy any other rights or moral principles put forth by Kant or derived from Kant. But it's the exact same thing. So they're not Kantians. They're not deontological ethicists. Nozick, who is probably the most important libertarian philosopher, he actually did try to derive his libertarianism from Kant, and it's a huge failure. In fact, later in his life, he said it was a failure. Nozick is more important for how he was able to attack other ideas such as utilitarianism and hedonism in his work, than make a good case for libertarianism. But another way to justify the non-aggression principle is through social contract theory, which is how I did it when I did my Ayn Rand videos, because I have absolutely no idea from reading Ayn Rand how exactly I'm supposed to derive this non-aggression principle from. Because she just derives it from the idea that human beings are rational, but that makes no actual argument. So I used the social contract model to try to show people how you could make a rational argument for non-aggression using a social contract model. The problem is the libertarians and Randians deny social contract theory. So where are they getting this from? From their philosophy, you can't get it. You can't get there from here.
Nietzsche, while being someone with a poetic and mystical way of expressing himself, was not a man that could escape the metaphysical fallacies caused by suppressing objective facts. For those that like the works of Nietzsche, I would agree there is much to enjoy, though sadly many of his admirers have completely succumbed to relativist lunacy.
Once again, pretty sure he hasn't read him.
While there are times when a relative perspective can help, like deciphering the testimonials of witnesses in court, I find that many relativists are like babies, unable to distinguish between a sense of self and the world around them. So I'm afraid that thanks to our growing understanding of logic and reason, relativism has little use for defining reality.
He's not making his arguments based on logic and reason. He's making his arguments based on science, which is different, because science is completely useless without logic and reason. Logic and reason has evolved since the beginning of philosophy, formal logic from Aristotle, and we have a greater understanding of it, but that has nothing to do with anything. It has nothing to do with what he's talking about. It has nothing to do with Nietzsche. Nietzsche just denied moral truths. He did not deny, he is not an epistemic realist. I just keep repeating the same thing because his entire video is based on a false premise, but he's not an epistemic relativist. Did I say realist before? He's not an epistemic relativist. He's not an epistemic relativist. I sound like a broken record, but I keep repeating it. This guy just wants to say anyone who doesn't agree with him is a relativist. I'm going to move on past his relativism arguments. I've already decided that what the third and fourth episodes will be, but I don't know what any future episodes will be, or if I'll even go beyond that. But I'll at least do a third and fourth episode of Bad Philosophy with Rock and Mystery.